Okay, welcome to the first lecture here in Encountering the World's Religions. I think it's very important that we understand, even as we begin looking at other religions, that we begin with even defining what is religion. And in particular, how do we approach religion? What is the function of religion? And how do we approach it in an academic way? And you're going to hear me say that many times. You're going to hear me use the term academic, and there's a reason why I'm doing that, and we'll talk about this as we go through this PowerPoint, this lecture on this PowerPoint. Excuse me. So, we're going to be looking at the definition of religion, and we're going to look at the history of studying religion. Now, notice I'm not saying that we're going to study the history of religion. We'll do that with particular religions. But here we're going to look at the history of the study of religion. And it's interesting to note that this is actually a relatively new field. And so we're going to look at the history of the study of religion, and we're also going to look at what it means to bring a theory or a method. I probably should say a theory and or a method to the study of religion. And essentially, I want you to be thinking about this as we get into the PowerPoint, and that is, how do we study a religion objectively? How do we study it in such a way that we do not allow our prejudices or our biases to get into to come into the process of understanding and studying a religion? And of course, a prejudice is a negative view towards something that may or may not be based on reality. Typically, it is not based on reality. And then a bias is a positive proclivity toward something that we may study. We're going to try to be as objective as possible as we approach this idea of religion. Now, that could be very controversial, especially at an institution, a Christian school like King University. And there would be many professors who teach at a faith-based institution, and they would argue that not only do you need to study these religions, but you need to study these religions in such a way that you understand how they're wrong, or, in my opinion, worse, how just how bad they are, and how much you disagree with them. And so I'm going to use a term here. There are many, say for instance, Christians who come from the perspective that their religion is the only correct religion, and therefore teaching this class would be a class on apologetics. Apologetics does not mean I'm sorry. Apologetics means the defense of the faith. Now, hear me very carefully. Without any apology, now to use that word in a different sense whatsoever, I come from a Christian worldview, and in particular, a Reformed Christian worldview. And but I'm not going to approach this PowerPoint or this class with an apologetic perspective. I want us to understand first how we study religion in a good scholarly academic way, and then I want us to approach these particular religions this semester I want us to approach them as objectively as possible. Let's just try to understand what's going on, why people turn to them, what is the function to that particular religion, without saying they're right or wrong. In many regards, as we'll talk about later on, this is based in many ways in the social scientific mode of studying, in particular anthropology. A good anthropologist goes to another culture and tries to understand a religion within that particular culture without bias or prejudice. So, our first question, and the major question for this PowerPoint, is what is religion? Now, you'll notice on this first slide that I've got a big word here, epistemology. And as we approach religion, we have to deal with the the problem or the question of epistemology here. And so epistemology is the theory of knowledge. In other words, how do we know what we know? This is a great question that has a very complicated answer. And so if there are religions who teach that they know some of the answers to life's toughest questions, some of humanity's most ultimate questions, then how do we know that we know? And in particular, in the last 200 to 300 years, religion has been extremely problematic. It has caused many wars, and literally millions of people over the last 200 to 300 years have died, quote unquote, in the name of God. And there are scholars and lay people who are trying to understand why religion can be so problematic. And in particular now in America after 9/11, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there were scholars, in particular sociologists, who were saying that religion will be a moot point in the 21st century. And wow, have they been wrong. Now, after 9/11, Americans are looking at religion and the interaction between not only other religions, but then even the difference between moderate and militant religion. We're going to approach all of those in this course, and so let's go ahead and get started. In the next slide, I have essentially, can't get it going. There it goes. This slide, just picture of different religions, and you'll notice just a few ideas here: Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Roman Catholicism, Hinduism. So we're going to look at the major religions around the globe today. So even as we get into this course, know that we're going to study Hinduism and Buddhism, Taoism with a little bit of Confucianism thrown in, because you cannot understand Taoism without Confucianism. And then we're going to look at the three major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All right, next slide. So, in the first place, we need to look at the difference between faith and knowledge. Faith versus knowledge. Is there a significant difference? And I would argue absolutely yes. Knowledge is that which we can observe, that which we can measure, and that which we can verify. This goes back to our roots in the modern age, in the age of the Enlightenment of um, empirical knowledge. Um, in many regards, we can only speak to that which we can verify. And faith is an entirely different matter. Now, that doesn't mean that faith is not based on knowledge or that knowledge has nothing to do with faith. People talk about blind faith. In the Reformed tradition, especially here at King, we believe deeply in a faith that is based in knowledge. But I want you to understand that there is a huge difference between faith and knowledge. And basically, there are faith statements that we cannot verify. And so when I went to college and then grad school, went to a very conservative college and grad school, and I was taught that you could prove God. Well, I have a problem with that. If you can prove God, then if one can prove God, then one does not believe in God. Where is faith in that? Plus, it also really brings into question the modes of knowledge there. How does one know absolutely that God exists? Do I believe that God exists? Absolutely. And so be thinking about that as we move on. There is a profound difference between faith and knowledge. Another way of putting that is the difference between private and public evidence. And so private knowledge is what we would call subjective or individual, or knowledge that exists within ourselves that you can't bring out into the public domain and question that. And in particular, to verify that. And so, as we talk about studying religion, we need to understand the difference between private and public. This is one of the great advantages to an academic study of anything. As scholars, we're supposed to publish. Why? So that we get our ideas out there and we get it into the public arena and people can argue and question. And so that essentially whatever we think cannot be just one person. It's actually a communal idea. There has to be a consensus, and there cannot be just one person out there who is correct. And so truth in many ways comes to light and is decided upon by the community. Okay, so who gets to decide what religion is? Is it an emic or an etic? Emic is, again, just a very fancy word for private, or you'll see here I'm using the word insider, or etic or etic, an outsider knowledge. And an insider knowledge essentially is someone who stands within that position. And so, for instance, if you're going to study Christianity, do you ask someone who is an insider or an outsider? Are you going to get better knowledge from an insider or an outsider? What's the most effective way to understand this particular religion? And so again, look at the idea of epistemology here, but also I want to bring in the whole idea of authority. And so let me put it this way. Are you going to get a better picture of a particular religion if you hear it from an insider or an outsider? Or maybe a better way to put that, and we talk about this in my class at King, who's going to be more right? And what is the most effective way here to study religion? And so, for instance, ask yourself this question. What is the disadvantage to hearing from an insider? Think about that for just a few seconds. Uh, what would we hear if we heard from an insider? And um, the positive answer would be we would hear from an insider because probably this is a person who has grown up in this religion. They would know the finer details. They could tell you what it's like to experience this religion. They have a take that an outsider, in many regards, will never have. But what is the disadvantage? The disadvantage is they're already predisposed toward this, and they are not separate from what they believe. And so, to go back to our former slide, they essentially confuse faith with knowledge, and they don't have a good methodology to separate what is faith and what is knowledge. And so, an outsider, what's the advantage to being an outsider? The advantage to be an outsider is I'm going to stand away from this and try to understand it as best as I can. And as an outsider, I'm going to bring in a discipline. All right, now this will be, honestly, the rest of this lecture. I'm bringing in a theory, a methodology. In this case, we're going to look at theories from the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and psychology. What does it mean for me to stand outside of the religion and use a methodology to understand religion? Here's one of the major issues, even as we begin. There is a major difference between theology and religion. Theology is essentially the view of religion from an insider's perspective. Religion, and this is in the last 200 to 300 years, religion, or the study of religion, assumes an outsider perspective, and it assumes a discipline, a theory, a method that helps us understand what is the function of religion. And so, for instance, in anthropology, these are social scientists who have been practicing now for about 150 years, and they continue to refine their study. And so an anthropologist will, at this point, go to another culture and immerse themselves in that culture, but they will not become an insider. Is there a disadvantage to this? Absolutely. But they're trying to understand the function of a particular religion without judging it, without bringing in value statements, without saying, well, that's really stupid. Again, this is a modernist enterprise of trying to understand even how we approach religion. So, this class will assume the outsider perspective. Even when we get to Christianity, knowing that I am an insider and I definitely come from this worldview, we're still going to try to step back and understand what is actually going on. This leads us to the whole idea of interpretation. And so, for instance, here I've got a slide on a box of Wheaties. In the academic world, how would we understand what's going on here on something as mundane as a box of Wheaties? How do we understand the culture, and why is Michael Jordan on there, and what does he represent as a metaphor, and what is this this company? What are they trying to sell, and what is the idea that they're trying to get you to buy into, so that you will buy into Wheaties? And so there are all kinds of different ways of looking at a box of Wheaties. You can look at it from a nutrition and health studies perspective. You can look at it from a marketing business. You can look at it from the idea of what is Madison Avenue doing? How are they using words and symbols and images to get people to make decisions. And so, what we're talking about here now replace Wheaties with a particular religion. How do we approach what we are studying? We can also now, I'm going to go into more of the theories and the social scientific theories, but uh, rather than Madison Avenue, we can pull in Marxism. And what does it mean to look at some of these religions as a Marxist? Now, again, I'm not a Marxist, but what I mean here is Karl Marx, and we'll talk about him in just a little bit, was a major theorist, and he said a lot about religion, and he talked about the interaction between money and religion, and capitalism and religion. And so he's going to give us an idea of how to approach. We have post-colonial studies, African American studies. These are people who bring their unique perspective and not necessarily subjective experience. Yes, that plays into it, but they bring their unique perspective on how to approach these religions. We have women's studies, very important today. You will notice that every single theorist that we're going to talk about is a man. Anything wrong with that? No, not at all. But now, in the last 30 years, we have women who are bringing their interpretations to the study of religion and what it means to understand religion from a womanist perspective. And this becomes important also. Again, I hope you hear the whole idea that as we study this, it's very dangerous to have a private interpretation. We need to bring our ideas out into the public and let people criticize them and critique them, and with the end goal of we eventually will come to a consensus. So, for instance, take a look at these two images. On the left, we have Palestinians who you can tell they are anonymous. They are part of the Palestinian issue. We'll study this later on in another course, attacking Israelis. But what do they represent? As soon as you see that image, what pops into your mind? Think about the biases and the prejudices that you may or may not have. If you're pro-Israel, think about what pops into your mind. If you're pro-Israel, what is it that this image represents? On the right, what does this image represent to you? What pops into your mind? Again, what are the biases and the prejudices? So in many regards, as we go through this, it's going to be important that you keep in mind not only a good theory or method to approach these religions with, but also keep in mind your own biases and prejudices as we approach this. And of course, we dealt with this in Bible Study That Matters, BIBL 2250. Okay, so what is religion? In many regards, I'm going to look at different theorists, but I want you to know that the study of religion is quite new. The word religion itself, religio, is a Latin word, and notice that's very important that I'm saying that it's a Latin word, which means that it's kind of a new kid on the block in the history of humanity. And so religio in the Latin means to bind or to connect. And it's interesting to note that in Hinduism, which, by the way, Hindus do not call themselves Hindus, the British gave the term Hindu, Hindi, to the Indian people, the Far East Indian people, And the Hindus do not have a word for religion. And I think that's very important to understand. In many regards, what I'm trying to emphasize there is they are such insiders that there's no sense of standing outside of their religion, their culture, their family. It's all interconnected and intertwined. In many ways, the study of religion is a new and Western concept where we stand outside and we call something else religion, and we try to look at it from an academic perspective. Well, Karl Marx was one of the first theorists of religion, and yes, he was very negative toward religion, but we need to understand that he was essentially a sociologist. He was an economist, and he was trying to understand the interaction of religion and politics. And so Marx will make the famous statement that religion is the opiate of the masses. And before you judge that too quickly, understand what Marx was grappling with. He was saying that in the West, religion has become problematic because it has been so interconnected with capitalist thinking. And so the wealthy use religion, and here Christianity and Judaism, they use religion to try to convince people that they're happy, even though they may be poor. And again, you've got to go back to the mid to the late 1800s in the Industrial Revolution, and by that time we were seeing the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, but we were also seeing the excesses and the abuses. And so Marx was taking a good hard look at that. And these wealthy individuals, business owners, and extremely wealthy people in the West, he was arguing that they were using religion to tell people, well, yeah, life is bad right now, but in the future, in the afterlife, you've got a good promise of being wealthy, so you can endure all these harsh conditions now because in the future it's going to be much better. And so Marx will argue that religion is an opiate. It makes people sleep. It calms their anxieties and lets them live a good life even though they're living a very difficult life. And so he will argue that religion is actually used to justify the status quo. Then we also have another theorist. So Marx was in England during the time of William James. William James is in America, and he will ask the question, what is religion? And he will introduce the idea, at least in America, of bringing psychology. All right, so we've seen sociology with Marx. He will bring the idea of, William James will bring the idea of psychology to understanding religion, and he will write a book that is still influential to this day called The Varieties of Religious Experience. William James will be, he's the brother of his more famous Henry James, and William James will write this book as a professor at Harvard, and he will basically argue that religion must be defined by different people's experiences. Now notice he's becoming a little more insider, if you will, but he's becoming, probably a better way to put it is, he's becoming more subjective. Subjective meaning that I approach reality, I approach truth from my own experience. Objective, I try to stand outside of my experience. James is going to say that if you really want to understand religion, you have to look at the experience or the experiences that religion brings. And so there are many human beings who turn to religion for a certain purpose, and in particular for a certain psychological experience. And so, what you do is you line up all these different religions and all their different experiences, and that will help you understand religion much better. If you want to, I would encourage you to come back. We won't take the time right now, but I would encourage you to come back and look in particular at a couple of these slides. You'll notice on this slide that William James is talking about this idea of even pathological experiences. And he said that these must be studied by psychologists, and this becomes very important. As you probably already know, there are easily many pathologies when it comes to adherence to religion, and James will begin to address that topic. In our day, and this is more my generation, but Jim Jones in Guyana, and the mass murder there, the mass suicide there, and David Koresh. What's going on with these people who will go to the point of killing others or killing themselves? Then we have Emil Durkheim. He will also be a sociologist, and so sociology is looking at essentially the study of society and how society constructs itself, and who are the leaders, and what are the economics, and so forth. And Durkheim will be a major thinker, and he will also take on the quote-unquote problem of religion. And Durkheim will argue that human beings turn to religion because it is the social glue. That's his famous statement. And so he will argue that God is society, society is God. In other words, God who is abstract, God who cannot be observed, God who cannot be measured, will be seen in society. And so morality and social mores and different cultural experiences and teachings will be God essentially, and you see this everywhere in humanity. This is quite a global experience, and so he will argue that. And listen to this very carefully. He will argue that religion is not necessarily religion. Religion is actually society. And so to understand religion, you have to be a sociologist. And Durkheim to this day is very influential. We have another psychologist, and this is probably, you may not know these other thinkers. You probably knew something about Marx, but here's Freud. And Freud, religion will be a real bugaboo for Freud. Freud, again, the methodology, the theory that he's going to use to understand religion will be psychology. Many people think that Freud is the father of psychology, and rightly so. And so Freud will have no qualms about saying that he is an atheist. He thinks that religion is a real problem, that it causes neuroses in individuals, and also is a result of neuroses. And so to Freud, religion is a crutch to prop up weak human beings, and religion is something that is infantile. And you'll notice on the slide here, I use his terms, it is wish fulfillment through projection. And so we can't face our deaths. Therefore, we invent a way of saying that there is an afterlife. We love the Father but can't have the Father. And so we, quote unquote, invent the Father figure, God the Father. And so Freud, it's really fascinating. I encourage all my students to read Freud because he has incredible insights. And again, we may disagree with Freud, but he's grappling with what I would argue are some of the pathological understandings and expressions of religion. Go back to William James. Why do we have some real craziness and even violence in religion? And Freud was trying to understand that. I disagree with his atheism, but I do agree with some of his assessments. And so Freud will argue that religion is actually not religion, but psychological neuroses, and therefore we need to understand it. We need to study it to understand it better. The next theorist is Ernst Becker, and he will be termed as an existentialist. And Becker will be famous because he will argue that religion is there to help people handle the terror of death. To this day, one of the major theories of understanding religion is terror theory, that people turn to religion because they're afraid of the loss of their own consciousness. And so Becker is, again, very influential. Existentialism, by the way, is a philosophy, a theory that we can only know what we experience. We can only know by what we have in our direct existence. Existentialism is opposed to what is called essentialism. Essentialism is there are basic truths that are true no matter what our experience. Existentialism says that we are limited to our existence, and so as an existentialist, he is looking at how human beings use religion to handle their deaths. The next theorist is Clifford Geertz, and he is an anthropologist, but in particular, he is a cultural anthropologist. Yet he will also emphasize the use of symbols. Geertz will argue that, going back to Durkheim, that yes, religion is used to construct society and to regulate society, and symbols become very important in this process. And so Christians wear a cross, and Jews wear a star, and Muslims have their crescent, and Hindus have their tridents. All of this has profound meaning for the religious adherents. And Geertz is going to argue that religion is actually a system of symbols that constructs a cosmos out of chaos. And again, we may disagree with Geertz in certain expressions, but I think he's right on here. And in many regards, even going back to Genesis 1, where we have cosmos and then we have chaos, and then God creates cosmos out of that chaos. And so human beings to this day are grappling with this concept. And he's going to say that religion is a system of symbols to help us deal with the chaos of life. Boyer, very influential. Now we're bringing in the hard sciences, and Boyer has written a book essentially titled Religion Explained. And Boyer is an evolutionary biologist. And it's interesting to see in the last 20 to 30 years, some of these theorists come along trying to use not the soft or the social sciences, but trying to use the hard sciences. So, neuroscience and biology and biogenetics, terms that, trust me, I am not, this is not my field, I'm not trained in this. But Boyer has some very interesting ideas, and he's trying to understand why human beings, even though religion in many regards is counterintuitive to evolution, why do human beings turn to religion? And why do they practice, in some ways universally, certain beliefs that are counterintuitive? And so, if you ever get a chance, read his book. It's extremely fascinating. Again, he has great insights, and he's arguing that we can actually, rather than seeing religion as something antithetical to evolution, that it is something that it has actually participated closely within evolution. Probably the most important thinker, at least as far as a synthesis to the things that we are talking about, is Bruce Lincoln, professor at University of Chicago. My apologies for such a long slide here, but you'll notice that I have bolded 4 words, 4 basic ideas. And so this is the slide. And again, we're looking at religion from an edict perspective, from an outsider perspective, from a as scientific perspective as we can have. And Lincoln has a great definition from that perspective. He will argue that religion is a discourse, a conversation, again, bringing the private ideas out into the public arena. It is a discourse whose concerns transcend the human, temporal, and contingent, the non-obvious, and that claims for itself a similarly transcendent status. In other words, religion is a conversation about that which moves beyond the observable, the verifiable. There is something else. And he will also say that it is a set of practices. Now, again, what Lincoln is trying to do here is trying to emphasize the things that are universal to religion. And so as he talks about a set of practices, it's interesting to note that every single religion, I may be wrong here, but every single religion has particular practices. And so a set of practices whose goal is to produce a proper world, go back to Geertz's Chaos and Cosmos, and or proper human subjects as defined by a religious discourse to which these practices are connected. We see this in particular in the orthopraxic religions like Hinduism, Islam, Judaism. I many times tell my students, go to New York, go to Brooklyn, you're going to see some Jewish individuals. How do you know? Because of the way that they are dressed, the way that they practice. They don't eat pork, so forth and so on. And Lincoln is bringing out this idea, very, very important. Number 3, it's a community whose members construct their identity with reference to a religious discourse and its attendant practices. Notice how he's building off of the 2 that have gone before. And then number 4, it is an institution, and this is kind of, at least in my opinion, the good news, bad news to religion. You have these great founders like Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad, and eventually their message gets institutionalized. Good news, bad news. It's an institution that regulates religious discourse, practices, and community, reproducing them over time and modifying them as necessary, while asserting their eternal validity and transcendent value. So there you go. Great slide. Great quotes here from Bruce Lincoln. In my opinion, he has the best understanding of religion. And here is the Oxford English Dictionary giving us an idea of what I talked about from the very beginning. Now, let me say one more thing and we'll be done. The academic study of religion is, as I've said before, the new kid on the block. And in many regards, we didn't start studying religion academically until the 1600s, until the horrible wars of religion in the 17th century. And once the Protestant Reformation came to the fore, this led to horrible wars for almost a century in Europe. And by the time these wars were exhausted in Europe, there were thinkers, and some of these people were diplomats, some of them were politicians, some of them would eventually be the social scientists that we're talking about. The beginning of the academic study of religion began with the idea of, why do people kill others in the name of God? And is there something that we can do to transcend this? And notice in the 1600s, you've got the clash within Christianity between Catholics and Protestants. But you've also got the Jewish community in Europe, and you've got the Muslims who are to the east and to the southwest, and all of a sudden you begin to see people who only saw one religion growing up, or maybe two. Now they're seeing multiple religions, and these religions are clashing and people are dying. And so the study of religion actually came out of this question of, how do we try to answer the question of what's going on with religion, in that it will kill people in the name of God, and is there a solution? Now, it's interesting to note, especially again in America here after 9/11, we're trying to grapple with that question like never before. This is, in many regards, the clash between Christianity and Islam. And so part of what I want you to see as we go through this class, I think this class is very important, especially for Christians in the 21st century. Do we offer anything here? What does it mean for us to have a good public discourse? What does it mean for us to be good scholars as we approach not only religion, but the problem of religion? All right, I'll see you in the next lecture.